Have you ever wondered what a narcissist is really like when no one else is around? Think about someone who easily wins people over with confidence, charm, and an almost magnetic presence. They walk into a room expecting attention, and most of the time, they get it. But what if the version they show the world is only part of the story? Imagine seeing that same person without the audience they rely on, with no one to impress and no image to protect. What often appears in those private moments can be surprising, uncomfortable, and even difficult to understand. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating aspects of narcissistic psychology, the strange and often disturbing behaviors that tend to emerge when narcissists are completely alone. This isn't about shaming or attacking anyone. It's about uncovering the emotional forces that shape these hidden habits, many of which develop from deep insecurity, unresolved emotional pain, and an overwhelming need to protect a carefully constructed identity. What you're about to discover may completely change the way you understand narcissism. Throughout this discussion, we'll draw from psychological research, clinical observations, and the experiences of people who have dealt closely with narcissistic individuals. Stay with me until the end as we gradually uncover what really happens behind the scenes in a narcissist's private life. From the outside, everything may appear polished, successful, and under control. But beneath that image often lies a world filled with compulsive routines, emotional instability, and behaviors that rarely make sense to anyone else. These hidden actions aren't random. They often serve as coping mechanisms designed to protect a fragile sense of self while desperately chasing the validation they can never seem to hold on to. Welcome to Narcissist Code, where we explore the hidden psychological patterns behind narcissistic behavior with honesty, understanding, and a commitment to awareness rather than judgment. As we move through this topic, I invite you to stay curious instead of critical, because the things narcissists do in private reveal far more than the image they present in public. Their secret behaviors offer important clues about the emotional conflicts, manipulation patterns, and endless search for admiration that shape their lives. By understanding these inner dynamics, we gain clearer insight into why they behave the way they do and how those around them are affected. Knowledge creates awareness, and awareness creates the opportunity for healing and healthier boundaries. So let's begin by looking at what happens when a narcissist is finally left without an audience. The praise disappears, the compliments stop, the attention they constantly seek is suddenly gone. In that silence, they are left face to face with the gap between the confident identity they project and the vulnerable person they work so hard to hide. It is often in these quiet moments that some of their most unusual and revealing habits begin to surface. One of the first patterns many experts notice involves the narcissist's relationship with their own reflection. When completely alone, many spend long stretches of time standing before a mirror. This goes far beyond checking their appearance or fixing their hair. Instead, it becomes a private performance where they admire, study, and reinforce the image they desperately want to believe is real. When no one else is around, many narcissists begin reinforcing the image they desperately want to believe about themselves. They may whisper compliments under their breath, repeat positive statements, obsess over tiny flaws that no one else would notice, or take dozens of photos and videos only to examine each one later. To someone watching from the outside, these routines might seem excessive, confusing, or even heartbreaking. But for the narcissist, they often serve an important psychological purpose. The mirror becomes more than a reflection. It becomes an audience that never walks away. When admiration from other people is unavailable, they attempt to provide it for themselves, creating a repetitive cycle of self-obsession that temporarily eases their inner discomfort. Ironically, this behavior does not reveal genuine confidence. It often exposes the exact opposite. Beneath the polished appearance lies a fragile self-esteem that constantly needs reassurance because it cannot sustain itself for very long without outside approval. Psychologists have long recognized that narcissistic personalities depend heavily on continuous reinforcement to preserve their sense of importance. This is why the mirror often becomes far more than a grooming tool. It turns into a way of protecting an identity that feels unstable beneath the surface. The endless adjusting, posing, fixing, admiring, and criticizing is rarely just vanity. It is often an effort to hold together an image built almost entirely on recognition, admiration, and the illusion of perfection. When those outside sources disappear, the carefully constructed identity begins to weaken. After the mirror is put aside, another revealing behavior frequently appears. Many narcissists spend long periods talking to themselves, but these conversations are rarely calm or balanced. Instead, they shift between celebrating themselves and tearing themselves down. One moment, they convince themselves they are exceptionally talented, attractive, influential, or misunderstood. The next, they become consumed by a mistake, an insult, or a moment that bruised their ego. Some even speak about themselves in the third person, creating a strange inner drama where they play the champion, the victim, and the harshest judge all at once. This ongoing internal dialogue exposes a reality they work hard to hide. The confidence everyone sees is often covering deep insecurity, self-doubt, and unresolved emotional wounds. Mental health professionals often describe this as the struggle between the ideal version of themselves they present publicly and the vulnerable self they secretly fear exists underneath. Without distractions or applause, that internal conflict becomes impossible to escape. Alone with their thoughts, they defend themselves, criticize themselves, justify their actions, and replay old emotional injuries over and over again, revealing just how unstable their inner world can truly become. Their private habits extend well beyond mirrors and conversations with themselves. In today's world, many narcissists replace face-to-face admiration with digital validation, turning social media into another emotional lifeline. Hours can disappear as they repeatedly check likes, comments, shares, and follower counts, searching for reassurance that they still matter. They often revisit old posts, study photographs, reread compliments, and quietly monitor the profiles of people who once admired them, rejected them, competed with them, or challenged their status. This pattern can quickly become addictive because every notification offers a brief emotional reward, while every silence feels deeply personal. A compliment creates temporary relief, but the feeling fades almost immediately. Someone else's success may trigger jealousy, while a lack of attention can feel like a personal attack. Because their self-worth depends so heavily on external approval, they become trapped in an endless cycle of comparison, anticipation, and disappointment. Research has shown that social media can intensify narcissistic tendencies because it constantly provides opportunities for attention, competition, and image management. Yet it also magnifies the emptiness they are trying to avoid. The more admiration they receive, the more desperately they need the next wave of it. When alone, the phone often replaces the mirror. The screen becomes their stage, notifications become applause, and endless scrolling temporarily distracts them from the insecurities waiting beneath the surface. Alongside this digital obsession, another disturbing pattern often emerges. Many narcissists spend long periods imagining revenge against anyone who embarrassed, criticized, ignored, rejected, or challenged them. They replay old conversations repeatedly, rewriting them in their minds and creating detailed fantasies where they regain power, silence their critics, and restore the sense of superiority they believe was taken from them. When these thoughts take over, many narcissists begin creating detailed imaginary scenarios where they finally come out on top. They picture future conversations in which they deliver the perfect comeback, leaving the other person speechless. They imagine becoming so successful that everyone who underestimated them is forced to watch from the sidelines with regret. In their minds, they receive praise, recognition, and admiration, while those they believe hurt them experience embarrassment or failure. Some even write these fantasies in journals, record emotional voice messages, or rehearse heated arguments that will never actually happen. These private rituals give them a temporary feeling of control whenever they feel emotionally threatened or powerless. By rewriting events in their imagination, they can restore the sense of importance they believe was taken from them. Studies in psychology consistently show that narcissistic individuals are unusually sensitive to criticism, rejection, and even subtle signs of disrespect. Emotional wounds that many people would eventually move past often remain active in their minds. Once they are alone and no longer distracted by social interactions or opportunities to impress others, those buried feelings frequently return with surprising intensity. Over time, unresolved anger can grow into persistent resentment, obsessive thinking, and emotional hostility. Although these fantasies may never become real actions, they reveal just how deeply narcissistic injuries can affect their inner world. What makes these imagined stories especially troubling is that they often become disconnected from reality. Rather than remembering events as they truly happened, the narcissist gradually reshapes them until the story protects their ego. In these rewritten memories, they often cast themselves as both the innocent victim and the triumphant hero. This self-created narrative helps preserve the image they desperately want to maintain, but it also distances them from accepting responsibility or viewing situations objectively. The more they retreat into these imagined victories, the harder it becomes to acknowledge mistakes, recognize their role in conflicts, or face uncomfortable truths about themselves. Their imagination becomes a safe place where control is never questioned and their identity remains untouched, even if reality tells a very different story. It is within these hidden moments, far away from public attention, that the true nature of narcissism becomes easier to understand. Beneath the appearance of confidence and superiority often lies a complicated psychological struggle shaped by fragile self-worth, unresolved emotional pain, fear of failure, and an endless craving for validation that never seems to last. When the need to feel important collides with the fear of being exposed or rejected, their inner world slowly becomes a constant emotional battle. While solitude allows many people to reflect, grow, and heal, it often has the opposite effect for a narcissist. Instead of finding peace, they become trapped inside repetitive mental performances where they relive imagined victories, justify old conflicts, and strengthen long-held resentments. Breaking free from this pattern would require confronting painful realities they have spent years avoiding, so the cycle continues. Rather than allowing difficult memories to fade naturally, they repeatedly revisit every insult, criticism, rejection, embarrassment, or disappointment. Each replay adds more emotional weight until the event feels even more significant than it was in the beginning. Ironically, what they believe is protecting them is actually keeping emotional wounds permanently open. By refusing to let go, they continue feeding the very pain they are trying to escape, making their already fragile self-esteem even more dependent on external reassurance. Many narcissists also spend long periods reviewing old conversations, scrolling through past messages, rereading emails, replaying voice recordings, checking social media interactions, or documenting every situation they believe proves they were treated unfairly. To someone looking from the outside, these habits may appear irrational or obsessive, but for the narcissist, they serve a deeper emotional purpose. Every remembered conflict becomes more evidence supporting the belief that they have been misunderstood, disrespected, or wronged. This is not healthy self-reflection. It is an emotional cycle that continually strengthens anger, bitterness, and resentment. Psychological studies suggest that repeated rumination causes painful memories to grow larger over time, making relatively small disagreements feel like serious betrayals. Eventually, these memories become woven into the person's identity, reinforcing the belief that they are almost always the victim of other people's actions. As the years pass, these private routines often become even stronger. Social isolation increases, resentment deepens, and the need for admiration becomes more intense than ever. The confidence others see on the surface frequently hides an inner life filled with insecurity, envy, fear, and emotional instability. Perhaps the greatest contradiction is that many narcissists spend their lives chasing love, respect, and recognition while repeatedly engaging in the very behaviors that make genuine closeness and authentic human connection almost impossible to achieve. The emotional defenses narcissists build to protect themselves often become the very barriers that keep them emotionally trapped. Behind the confident image they work so hard to maintain is often someone locked in an endless effort to prove they are worthy, avoid shame, and control a reality that refuses to match the version they have created in their minds. Recognizing these hidden patterns should never be confused with excusing manipulation, emotional abuse, or harmful behavior. Instead, it helps explain the psychological forces operating beneath the surface. The strange routines, obsessive habits, fantasies of revenge, and relentless need for validation are not signs of genuine confidence or emotional strength. In many cases, they reveal an inner world struggling to stay emotionally balanced. Once the carefully crafted mask begins to slip, what emerges is far more complex than simple arrogance. We often find someone caught in a painful conflict between feeling superior and secretly feeling inadequate, between craving admiration and fearing rejection, between inflated self-importance and deep self-criticism. Ironically, it is in the quiet moments, when there is no audience to impress and no praise to collect, that the most revealing truths about narcissism begin to appear. One of the last and perhaps most revealing behaviors appears when narcissists are completely alone, with no one else's opinions shaping the moment. During these private hours, many rely on repetitive rituals designed to strengthen an identity that feels far less stable than it appears. They may spend long periods looking into mirrors, quietly praising themselves, replaying imagined conversations where they always come out ahead, or carefully arranging their surroundings to support the flawless image they desperately want to preserve. Their minds often drift into elaborate fantasies filled with future success, overwhelming recognition, admiration from others, or revenge against people who once doubted, criticized, rejected, or underestimated them. These imagined scenes can become incredibly detailed. They mentally rehearse conversations again and again until every word feels perfect. They picture themselves receiving applause, proving everyone wrong, and finally achieving the status they believe they deserve. Every memory of criticism is rewritten until they emerge as the unquestioned victor. These private performances are often accompanied by constant internal praise that exaggerates their talents, accomplishments, and personal importance. To an outsider, this inner dialogue might sound like extraordinary confidence and complete self-belief. In reality, however, those grand thoughts often serve as protection against a much quieter emotional current made up of fear, insecurity, uncertainty, and persistent self-doubt. The louder the inner voice insists on greatness, the more it may be trying to silence the fragile feelings it cannot bear to face. This constant need to mentally elevate themselves is often connected to what psychologists describe as emotional compensation. Instead of developing a stable sense of self-worth from genuine self-acceptance, many narcissistic individuals rely on repeated mental reinforcement to quiet feelings of inadequacy. Their private routines become a way of convincing themselves that they are exceptional, admired, or destined for greatness, even when reality does not support those beliefs. The more uncertain they feel internally, the more intensely they may cling to these rituals. This creates a cycle where temporary emotional relief quickly fades, forcing them to repeat the same behaviors again and again. Rather than building real confidence, these habits simply maintain the illusion of confidence for a little while longer. The mind becomes caught between protecting a carefully constructed identity and avoiding the painful emotions that threaten to expose its underlying fragility. Another important part of this process involves what many mental health professionals call identity maintenance. A narcissist often invests enormous emotional energy into preserving a particular image of themselves, not only in public, but also in private. Even when no one else is watching, they continue acting as though they must perform for an invisible audience. They mentally replay compliments, exaggerate personal achievements, or imagine future moments where others finally recognize their greatness. This constant performance is not simply about vanity. It reflects a deep fear that without continual reinforcement, the identity they have created will begin to collapse. Because so much of their self-esteem depends on admiration instead of genuine self-acceptance, silence can become emotionally uncomfortable. The absence of praise forces them to face emotions they have spent years avoiding, making their private rituals feel psychologically necessary rather than optional. Many narcissists also struggle with something known as emotional dependency on admiration. While most people enjoy appreciation, they can usually maintain their self-worth even when recognition is absent. A narcissist often experiences the opposite. Compliments, attention, praise, and acknowledgement become emotional fuel that temporarily stabilizes their fragile self-image. When those sources disappear, feelings of emptiness, anxiety, or restlessness frequently begin to surface. This explains why periods of solitude can become so emotionally challenging. Instead of using time alone to reflect or recharge, they often feel compelled to recreate validation through fantasy, self-talk, or imagined future success. These behaviors are not random habits. They function as psychological substitutes for the admiration they constantly seek from other people, allowing them to temporarily escape uncomfortable emotions without ever truly resolving them. Perhaps the deepest conflict lies in the difference between the person they believe they must appear to be and the person they secretly fear they are. This inner divide creates continuous psychological tension because maintaining a perfect image requires constant emotional effort. Every criticism feels larger than it truly is because it threatens the identity they have worked so hard to protect. Every perceived rejection seems to confirm their deepest fears, even if they never admit those fears openly. Rather than processing disappointment in a healthy way, they often rewrite events, blame others, or retreat into fantasies where they regain control and restore their sense of superiority. Over time, these mental habits create a self-reinforcing cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. The more they avoid uncomfortable truths, the more dependent they become on the very defenses that prevent genuine healing, authentic relationships, and lasting emotional stability. As these patterns continue over the years, the narcissist's inner world often becomes divided into two completely different realities. One reality is carefully displayed to everyone around them, where they appear confident, accomplished, emotionally untouchable, and deserving of admiration. The other reality exists entirely beneath the surface, where fear of failure, fear of rejection, and fear of being seen as ordinary quietly influence many of their decisions. The distance between these two identities grows wider with time, requiring more emotional energy to maintain the illusion. Every compliment briefly strengthens the false self, while every criticism threatens to expose the vulnerable self they have spent years trying to hide. This is why even small disagreements or harmless feedback can provoke reactions that seem far greater than the situation deserves. What others experience as a simple conversation, the narcissist may experience as a direct threat to the identity they rely on for emotional survival. Another psychological process that often unfolds in private is the constant search for certainty. Narcissists frequently struggle with emotional ambiguity because uncertainty makes them feel vulnerable and out of control. When they are alone, they may repeatedly replay conversations, facial expressions, or interactions, searching for hidden meanings that confirm they were either admired or wronged. They analyze situations from every possible angle until they find an explanation that protects their self-image. Instead of accepting that misunderstandings happen or that people sometimes disagree without malicious intent, they often construct narratives that place themselves in the strongest emotional position. This allows them to avoid feelings of accountability while preserving their belief that their reactions were justified. Although these mental exercises may temporarily reduce emotional discomfort, they also make it increasingly difficult to accept reality as it actually happened, causing distorted interpretations to become deeply rooted over time. This also explains why genuine self-reflection is often so difficult for narcissistic individuals. Healthy self-reflection requires a willingness to recognize personal mistakes without allowing those mistakes to define one's entire identity. For a narcissist, however, admitting fault can feel psychologically overwhelming because their self-worth is tied so closely to appearing exceptional. Instead of viewing mistakes as opportunities to learn, they may experience them as evidence that their carefully constructed identity is beginning to fall apart. To protect themselves from that emotional collapse, the mind automatically shifts toward rationalization, denial, blame, or fantasy. These defenses reduce immediate emotional pain, but they also prevent meaningful personal growth. Without the ability to honestly examine themselves, the same unhealthy patterns often repeat throughout relationships, careers, friendships, and family life, leaving them trapped inside cycles they rarely recognize as being partly of their own making. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that beneath all of these private rituals, imagined victories, emotional defenses, and carefully protected identities often exists a person who has spent much of their life believing that love, acceptance, and respect must be earned through perfection rather than received through authenticity. Instead of feeling secure simply for who they are, they become convinced they must constantly prove their value, outperform others, or maintain an image that leaves no room for ordinary human flaws. The more they chase this impossible standard, the further they drift from genuine emotional connection. Authentic relationships require vulnerability, honesty, accountability, and mutual trust. Yet these qualities become increasingly difficult to embrace when protecting the false self has become the mind's highest priority. In the end, the very strategies they depend upon to feel significant often become the greatest obstacles, preventing them from experiencing the acceptance and emotional security they have been searching for all along.